One empire. One ruler. One unspoken law. In the 1530s, the Ottoman Empire reached its golden age, and its darkest discipline. Behind the polished marble of Topkapi Palace, an invisible command governed every breath of its women. It was never written in the Canon-i Osmani, yet everyone inside the imperial harem knew it by heart. They called it the law of silence. It was not a rule of justice but of fear, a boundary that no woman dared to cross. Desire, emotion, or even a whispered opinion could destroy a life. The empire prized obedience above truth, and silence above love. At the center of this world stood the harem, not a chamber of pleasure, but a fortress of control. Layers of latticed screens separated women from the men who ruled them. Eunuchs guarded the corridors, silence guarded the throne. The harem was both the heart of the empire and its deepest prison. Every concubine was trained in silence from the day she entered. Tutors taught them languages, etiquette, and the art of restraint. A single mistake, a letter, a glance, an unsanctioned friendship, could bring punishment worse than death, erasure. Their names would vanish from records. Their portraits would be burned. Their stories would dissolve into rumor. By 1531, under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the harem became a kingdom of whispers. Power was balanced on loyalty, loyalty was measured in silence. Even the Sultan's own wife, Hurrem Sultan, knew that her influence depended on never appearing too human, too emotional, too flawed. Love could elevate, or it could annihilate. And yet, within those golden walls, humanity could not be extinguished. Every forbidden glance, every heartbeat hidden beneath silk, reminded the empire that even obedience could not kill desire. It is within this world that one woman's name would briefly flicker before being smothered, Layla, a favorite of the Sultan, whose crime was to feel too deeply. She would not survive the law of silence. But her story would expose how power punished love, and how empires feared emotion more than rebellion itself. In the year 1532, a caravan from the western provinces reached the imperial gates of Istanbul. Among the silks, spices, and captives destined for the court was a young woman whose name would soon circulate in whispers through the women's quarters, Layla. She was said to be of Circassian birth, trained in literature and calligraphy, fluent in Persian and Arabic. Her beauty was not the type that shouted, it was the stillness in her eyes, the composure that made even silence appear deliberate. Within Topkapi Palace, every arrival began the same way. The new women were bathed, clothed, catalogued, and assigned ranks. Their hair was perfumed with rosewater, their names entered into the harem register like inventory. For most, the process ended there, years of obedience, service, and eventual obscurity. But Layla's name did not stay in the lower pages. The chief attendant noticed her handwriting during the lessons in calligraphy. Her script was flawless, the lines steady and precise. When the Sultan's library required copyists to reproduce manuscripts damaged by humidity, Layla was chosen. For the first time, her hands touched the same paper as the men who ruled empires. In a world that forbade voices, her pen became her presence. By 1534, Layla was transferred from the novice chambers to the inner harem, a rare ascent achieved without patronage. The Sultan, Suleiman I, had grown weary of flattery. His evenings were filled with poetry, astronomy, and law. When Layla's translations reached him, he demanded to see the woman responsible. Their first meeting, recorded only in a single note by a court scribe, lasted less than 10 minutes. Yet from that moment she was counted among the favored. In the hierarchy of the harem, this was both privilege and peril. Favored women lived closer to the center of power, but also closer to its fire. The rooms of the favorites overlooked the imperial gardens, but each door was guarded by eunuchs who reported every visitor, every sound. They were dressed in silk yet surrounded by watchers. To be chosen by the Sultan was to enter a golden isolation. Layla adjusted with an ease that unsettled others. She neither competed for attention nor sought alliances with powerful concubines. Her restraint was mistaken for arrogance, and envy began to breathe behind her. The Valide Sultan, Sulayman's mother, whose word carried the weight of law inside the palace, observed her carefully. She saw a young woman who obeyed every rule but whose eyes betrayed a different kind of knowledge, one not taught within those walls. Historians later wrote that Layla possessed an intellectual charm, an ability to listen as if she already knew the end of every story. She would sit at the edge of the Sultan's study as scholars debated the Canon-i-Osmani, the imperial law code that sought to balance Sharia with royal will. Layla rarely spoke, yet when asked for her opinion on a line of poetry or a passage of Rumi, her answers revealed a mind both disciplined and dangerous because it was free. In 1535, the empire was expanding toward Mesopotamia. Victories filled the official chronicles, but inside Topkapi, the tone grew tenser. The execution of Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha the previous year had cast a long shadow. Suspicion now replaced conversation. Servants were interrogated for words overheard, letters were inspected under lamplight. The harem, once echoing with songs, fell quiet. It was during this time that Layla's isolation deepened. She began spending long hours in the palace library, copying verses for the Sultan's private collection. One surviving fragment in her handwriting reads, "The garden blooms, yet none may touch its root." Scholars debate whether it was her own verse or a translation, but its meaning haunted those who later studied her life. It captured the essence of every woman inside the harem, nurturing beauty they could never claim. Outside her chambers, the rhythm of discipline never stopped. Before dawn, the muezzin's call mixed with the shuffle of servants preparing incense. At sunrise, the Valide's inspectors walked the corridors to ensure order, every bed made, every garment folded, every sound recorded. In this theater of obedience, Layla maintained composure that looked almost divine. Yet those closest to her sensed fatigue behind her eyes, the cost of constant perfection. The Sultan's affection for her grew in measured steps. He would request her presence not for music or jest, but for quiet evenings when state documents awaited his seal. She read to him passages from Persian treatises on virtue, occasionally daring to ask questions that no one else would. "Is justice the servant of law, or its master?" she once wrote in the margin of a text later found in the archives. The note bears her signature mark, a small crescent inked beneath the word ADL, meaning justice. Such curiosity might have passed unnoticed in another court. But within Topkapi, where the unspoken law of silence already governed behavior, thought itself could invite scrutiny. Layla's growing intellect threatened to blur the line between obedience and opinion. By 1536, subtle changes surrounded her. Her attendants were reassigned, the servants who once carried her messages were replaced. The palace gossip shifted tone, from admiration to caution. Some said the Sultan valued her too much, others whispered he trusted her too little. Both were dangerous. That same year, the empire's censors began reviewing literary materials in the harem. Several works were removed from the shelves, among them, a Persian love poem about a woman who defied a king. The copyist's mark on the manuscript was Layla's. No accusation followed, but the record notes a temporary suspension of her duties. The silence that had once been her shield was now a signal of unease. Within a system that punished visibility and invisibility alike, Layla's very existence became precarious. Every step through the marble corridors echoed with risk. Every glance might be interpreted. Every breath could betray thought. And yet, she remained. Not because she was fearless, but because she believed knowledge itself was a form of worship, and to suppress it would be the greater sin. As the palace bells marked the dawn of 1537, Layla stood at her window overlooking the Bosphorus. The empire glittered beneath a cold blue sky. Ships carried riches from 3 continents, muezzins called prayers over a city that never questioned its rulers. From this view, power seemed eternal. But within those walls, a single thought, a single emotion, could end a life. Soon, that thought would be hers. And it would change everything that followed. By the winter of 1537, the empire's breath had grown heavy. Istanbul stood at the height of its splendor, yet those who lived inside its palaces knew that splendor was only the mask of control. Each wall of Topkapi concealed a secret. Each corridor had its listener. And within those quiet walls, Layla committed the smallest act of defiance possible. She looked back when someone looked at her. The man was no soldier, no prince. He was a scribe, one of the many scholars assigned to preserve the Sultan's expanding archive of law and poetry. His name does not survive in the records, perhaps it was erased intentionally. But in the margin of a surviving manuscript, historians later found an unfamiliar hand beside Layla's own script. The ink matched hers. The handwriting, almost the same. 2 minds meeting on the same page. It began, as every forbidden thing does, with curiosity. Layla had been tasked with reviewing Persian manuscripts damaged by moisture. The scribe was brought in to assist her. For hours they worked in silence, 2 figures separated by law and shadow, their voices reduced to whispers between the turning of pages. The connection was intellectual first, emotional later. But in the Ottoman court, thought and emotion carried the same weight of danger. Within the harem, the law of silence was more than a warning, it was survival itself. No woman was allowed to form attachment outside the Sultan's will. Her body was imperial property, her desire a potential crime. To want was to rebel. To feel was to threaten the system built upon her restraint. Still, Layla continued to meet the scribe in the palace library, where the scent of ink mixed with candle smoke and damp stone. Sometimes they exchanged fragments of verse between the pages of old books, not letters, not confessions, only lines that carried meaning invisible to others. The moon reflects the sun, yet dreams of its own light. One evening, she left that line folded between 2 pages of Rumi's Masnavi. The next day, another appeared beneath it in a different hand. And for dreaming, the moon is punished with darkness. That was enough. The palace was a machine built to detect emotion. Servants noticed the change, the quiet pause before she answered a question, the faint smile she could not suppress. Within weeks, the whispers began. Layla has become distant, one attendant reported. She stares at the sea when she should be praying. Another claimed to have seen a shadow slip into the library after nightfall. No one mentioned the scribe directly, but every insinuation pointed toward him. In March 1538, the first inquiry was launched by the Kisler Agassi, the chief black eunuch who ruled the harem's internal discipline. His authority was absolute, his loyalty unquestioned. His investigation was simple, to restore order before scandal reached the Sultan. The harem's version of justice operated without proof. Truth mattered less than preservation of image. If suspicion existed, silence would settle it. Witnesses were summoned, rooms searched, manuscripts examined. Among Layla's belongings, they found a folded scrap of parchment with a single verse, "To remember you is to remember God." The handwriting matched the anonymous notes. No confession was required. The law of silence interpreted affection as treason. The logic was cruel but precise. If a woman favored by the Sultan gave her heart to another, she had betrayed the empire itself. A sultan's possession symbolized divine order. To disrupt that order, even privately, meant defying Allah's shadow on earth. By the time the Sultan was informed, the outcome was predetermined. The Valide Sultan ordered that Layla be placed under private observation. Her attendants were dismissed, her doors guarded. She was not imprisoned, she was contained, erased from the rhythm of palace life. The scribe was dealt with quietly. One record from 1538 mentions a transfer to provincial service, a phrase often used to disguise execution. After that, no trace of him appears. His name dissolved like ink in water. For Layla, isolation was worse than death. Days turned into weeks of ritual silence, no music, no letters, no mirrors. The palace that once echoed with poetry now resounded with nothing but her own breathing. And in that void, she began to understand that the empire's greatest cruelty was not violence, but erasure. It was not enough to kill the body. One had to kill memory. Servants said she refused food. Others claimed she spent hours staring at her hands, as if trying to erase her own fingerprints. The Valide's messengers reported that her mind was unstable, the favored term for women who resisted breaking. Outside, Topkapi continued its routines. The Sultan signed new decrees, generals reported victories, and prayers rose from the minarets. Life in the empire never paused for those who disappeared. The harem absorbed silence the way marble absorbs footsteps, flawlessly, without echo. By late 1538, preparations were underway for her trial, though no law required it. It would not be a hearing of facts, but a ceremony of control, a ritual to remind the court that even the Sultan's affection had limits. In a single entry preserved by an imperial clerk, the event is described as the inquiry of a concubine whose conduct disturbed harmony. The phrase, disturbed harmony, appears nowhere else in Ottoman legal archives. It meant only one thing: the Sultan's favorite had loved without permission. What followed would not only end her life, but define the secret moral code that governed women for generations after. The trial of the Sultan's favorite would become the silent template for how desire was punished, elegantly, invisibly, permanently. Layla's final days before the tribunal remain unrecorded. But chroniclers agree on one detail: she was last seen at dawn, standing by the small courtyard fountain, touching the water with her fingers as if trying to remember its sound. The guards waited in silence. When she turned to them, she did not speak. The empire would later call her disobedient. History would call her forgotten. But in that moment, she was neither, only a woman who had dared to feel in a world that worshipped restraint. Her punishment would come soon. And with it, the legend of the law of silence would be carved into the very stone of Topkapi itself. The records call it a hearing, not a trial. But everyone inside Topkapi Palace understood what that word meant. A hearing was simply a verdict waiting for formality. In April 1539, before dawn, a procession of officials crossed the courtyard known as the Court of the Black Eunuchs. The torches burned low, even the fountains had been stopped so that water would not drown the sound of footsteps. In the empire of order, silence itself was choreography. At the center of this movement stood Layla, veiled in white linen, escorted by 2 attendants and a eunuch commander. Her fate would be decided not in the grand divan where matters of state were judged, but in a smaller chamber behind the Valide Sultan's apartments, a room reserved for internal discipline. Its walls were painted with floral motifs to mask their purpose. Behind them, women had vanished for less. The tribunal consisted of 5 people. 1 Qadi, a religious judge to lend legitimacy. 2 senior eunuchs to represent the Sultan's will. And 2 women from the Valide's household, tasked with observing female propriety. The Sultan himself did not attend, but his absence spoke louder than presence. When the Padishah remained unseen, the sentence was already known. The charges were read in the language of obedience. The favorite concubine Layla is accused of improper affection, private correspondence, and disturbance of imperial harmony. No evidence was required. The verses found in her chamber had already condemned her. Her silence during questioning was interpreted as pride, her composure, as guilt. Ottoman law possessed a framework for treason and theft, but not for emotion. Therefore, the law of silence filled the gap, an unwritten code allowing discipline beyond scripture or statute. It was created not by judges, but by fear, fear that desire could loosen the empire's carefully built hierarchy. The Qadi spoke of morality, quoting lines from the Canon-i Osmani about the duties of purity within the household of the Sultan. Each phrase sounded like prayer, but functioned as warning. He reminded those present that the Sultan's household symbolized divine order on earth. To love without sanction was to disrupt the reflection of God's justice. The eunuchs confirmed that the accused had been observed, withdrawn and melancholy. The female attendants confirmed unfeminine confidence. It was enough. Every witness described emotion as crime. Every sentence defended image, not truth. After the statements, the judge turned to the Valide's envoys. One nodded. That gesture replaced any written decree. The decision was sealed. Verdict: guilty of emotional insubordination. Sentence: erasure by confinement. The language was deliberate. Erasure was cleaner than death. It allowed the empire to claim mercy while ensuring oblivion. No public execution, no scandal, no grave with a name. Only silence. That night, Layla was taken through a service corridor that connected the harem to the abandoned pavilion of the gardeners, a small stone structure near the outer wall. It had once been used for plague quarantine. Few knew it still existed. Inside, the chamber smelled of lime and damp wood. A single lamp burned. There were no windows, only a narrow opening near the ceiling for air. She was told she would rest here until further notice. Everyone in the palace knew what that meant. According to one later account by a palace scribe, a man who risked death by recording forbidden events, Layla asked for water, then sat on the floor without speaking. A physician entered shortly after midnight carrying a small flask. Officially it contained opium for calm. Unofficially, it was part of the ritual of removal, sleep before silence. When dawn came, 2 attendants entered. The method was always the same, the silk cord. It was the empire's preferred form of execution for the privileged, bloodless, noiseless, invisible. One pulled, the other prayed. By sunrise, her body was gone. The palace registry marked her status as returned to God. No burial site was recorded. The fabrics and jewelry once assigned to her were redistributed to new favorites within days. Even her handwriting samples were destroyed under the pretext of renewing the archives. The same week, a feast was held in celebration of the Sultan's victories in the east. Musicians played in the courtyard above the cistern where her final breaths had vanished. That contrast, music above, silence below, was the empire's true rhythm. Yet fragments of her story survived in places the censors overlooked. In a letter from a Venetian ambassador dated June 1539, there is mention of a concubine whose death has disturbed the harmony of the imperial household. Another, written by a Spanish merchant 2 years later, speaks of a favored woman whose fate taught all others the cost of love. These whispers, carried by foreigners, preserved what the empire sought to destroy. Inside Ottoman memory, Layla ceased to exist; outside it, she became a symbol. For the harem, her disappearance became a silent warning. Mirrors were restricted. Private reading was discouraged. Servants were forbidden to linger in corridors. The word Layla itself was quietly removed from the list of permissible names for newborn attendants. Even her syllables became forbidden sound. The law of silence had fulfilled its purpose. It had turned a human being into absence, and through that absence, reinforced power. But history has a way of hearing what power tries to mute. Centuries later, when scholars studied the architecture of Topkapi, they found the pavilion walls layered with faint script scratched into the plaster. One fragment reads, "To love is not rebellion, to forget is." The handwriting was feminine. The lime had darkened around it like bruised skin. Whether those words were hers or another's will never be known. But they marked the place where silence once spoke. When the door to the pavilion closed for the last time, the empire did what it always did: it moved on. There were ceremonies to arrange, campaigns to record, laws to refine. The Sultan's scribe struck a single line through her name in the household ledger, then continued copying decrees as if nothing had been removed. But the absence remained, faint as the scent of rose oil that clung to her rooms. In the months after 1539, the Valide Sultan issued new instructions to the Harem Council. Every concubine was to be assigned a tutor in ilmi adab, the knowledge of conduct. Reading alone was forbidden. Mirrors larger than a handspan were replaced with polished bronze discs that distorted reflection. The rule was clear: beauty was permitted, self-knowledge was not. What had happened to Layla was never named, yet every woman inside those walls felt the shape of it. The corridors seemed quieter, the laughter shorter. The silence had learned to breathe. Beyond the palace, Istanbul thrived. Traders filled the harbors, muezzins called from hundreds of minarets, poets praised the Sultan as the shadow of God upon earth. None mentioned the shadow cast by his fear of feeling. The empire's greatness demanded perfection, and perfection required forgetting. Still, traces of the erased surfaced in unlikely places. A register from 1541 lists an unexplained expenditure: 3 measures of lime for repair of the outer pavilion. Another note in a Venetian report describes a whisper among the palace women that love can kill more swiftly than plague. Historians read these fragments not as facts, but as echoes, the only form in which forbidden memory could survive. Within the harem, the law of silence hardened into ritual. The chief eunuch kept a book known only as the Record of Purity, listing every servant transferred, punished, or dismissed for disturbing harmony. None of the offenses described violence or theft. Every one of them described emotion. In time, the rule expanded beyond the palace. Provincial governors adopted similar codes for their households. The empire had found a new instrument of order: emotional censorship masquerading as virtue. And yet, silence is never absolute. Decades later, during repairs to the garden wall, workers uncovered a small wooden tablet sealed inside the plaster. On it were carved 3 words in Ottoman Turkish: Ben vardım bir zaman, I once was. No signature, no date. The overseer ordered it destroyed, but a scribe copied the phrase into his notes before obeying. That act of quiet disobedience allowed one line of humanity to survive when names could not. By the end of Suleiman's reign, the empire stretched from Budapest to Baghdad. Its scholars debated law, its architects raised domes that touched the sky. Yet inside those walls, women still spoke in half-sentences, glancing toward the lattice before finishing a thought. The harem had become both legend and warning, a masterpiece built from obedience. Modern historians call this period the perfection of imperial control. But perfection, when built on fear, is only another form of decay. The punishment of Layla and others like her did not strengthen the empire, it revealed its weakness, its terror of the very emotions that made it human. 5 centuries later, the rooms of Topkapi stand empty. Tourists walk through them with audio guides and cameras, admiring the tiles, the geometry, the symmetry. Few notice how the ceilings absorb sound. Even today, when someone speaks above a whisper, the echo dies before it reaches the next arch. The stones were built to keep secrets. But history listens differently now. It gathers fragments, letters, architectural clues, and rebuilds what power tried to erase. The law of silence was meant to bury voices, yet it left enough traces for the future to remember what the past denied, that love inside an empire was never just personal, it was political, a challenge to the structure that defined obedience as holiness. Layla's life cannot be proved in documents, but her story exists in every blank space between them. She stands for those whose only rebellion was to feel, whose only weapon was memory. The empire silenced their words, time restored their meaning. Power survives through silence. But so does truth, waiting, patient, beneath the marble.